And in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about transparency, accountability, and policing, and also in IMPD. And can you tell us a little bit about your role as Deputy Chief and how that relates to the importance of transparency and accountability?
Primarily, my role is interagency operations, such as body cams, internal affairs, working with all of our external and internal boards. And all of those pieces kind of fit together to really they deal some with our transparency and our trust efforts within our community and within our police department. Oftentimes when we think of transparency, we think it's only relative to the community. And certainly that is a major component, but it also is relevant to the officers that we expect to have that transparency and have legitimacy.
Why is accountability and transparency important in policing and specifically within IMPD?
Well, the bottom line is, in order to have significant or have any crime reduction or any efforts to reduce crime in a community, you have to have trust in the authorities. And we really work hard and have worked hard over the last several years in building that trust and legitimacy. We have really worked to listen to our community because we believe that listening to our community is policing them in a way that they feel is equitable and at the same time will help us reduce crime. So the bottom line is, yes, adding more police officers is certainly an important element in any crime reduction effort, but it's equally important to have trust and legitimacy, because when communities say, when neighborhoods say, we're not going to allow this kind of behavior to happen in this neighborhood, and they tell police, and then police solve those crimes, that's how you build the transparency and legitimacy, and that's how you ultimately reduce crime.
Can you give us some examples of things that IMPD specifically has done in the last year, 2 years, to increase its transparency, increase its accountability?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since Chief Taylor has been named chief, we now release officers' names that are involved in officer-involved shooting within 5 days. Given we do a threat assessment to make sure that there's no threats against those officers, but that was an effort to build transparency, particularly as it relates to officer-involved shootings. We now have a dashboard that displays all officer-involved shootings information, to include the officers involved, the suspects, and some of the demographic information that goes along with those investigations. Those are just some of the efforts that we've taken to really be transparent. I think the other thing is we really have empowered our commanders to have conversations, to have intimate conversations with community members about information that we may not release publicly, but that they can have in those intimate conversations with folks. So, I mean, those are just some of the efforts that we've undertaken over the last couple years to really try to build transparency and build legitimacy. I think if you ask any chief, including Chief Taylor, they would like to release everything. The bottom line is they want to put it all out there. But there are limitations that we have. There are sometimes a criminal case that has to be accounted for. There are victims that have to be accounted for, folks' families that have to be accounted for. So there are a number of variables that really drive our decision about what to release and what not to release.
Can you speak to the role of civilian review boards and body cameras and their role of increasing legitimacy?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about specifically body cams, I mean, that is a major investment, right? Almost a $10 million investment that the City of Minneapolis and the City County Council and the police department have made to build transparency and legitimacy. And that was something the community wanted. It's certainly something police officers wanted too, but it was something certainly the community called for and demanded for, and we're happy to have them. So it helps when people can see an unbiased recording of the events that unfolded. Body cams is just one more tool. It's not, we still have to continue to work hard to build relationships with community members. Even those that don't want to sit at the table of the police, we still have to continue to invite those folks to the table. Body cams by themselves are not going to do it. However, it does help. And so anything that helps build trust and legitimacy, we have to we have to look at that, in this case, make a significant investment towards that effort.
Can you speak to some examples of things that wouldn't necessarily be part of the public domain and why those things wouldn't be shared with everybody?
You know, when you talk about things that may not be for public release, again, you know, I mentioned this earlier, but if we're talking about a criminal case where we are looking for a suspect, or, for example, a car accident where the family has not been notified, would be an example where we would not want to release information. Or in a criminal investigation where only the suspect and the investigator would know what transpired. That would be another information. It would hurt our criminal case to release information that only the suspect and only investigators know. It may prevent us from making an arrest, because then he or she could see it on TV and say, hey, I saw that on TV and this is what occurred. Well, that could potentially hurt that case, which impacts a family, right? Because often these are crimes against persons, and there's someone waiting for justice. And so if we release too much information too fast, it could certainly hurt that case and hurt that family that's waiting for justice. Now, you know, there have been some calls to publicly display discipline issues against police officers in a kind of general format. No problem here. And we have Citizen Complaint Board, for example, has a published dashboard that displays all the complaints that come in and all the and the resolutions to those complaints. So, you know, we're starting to see that, but to discuss specifically about an officer that has not been criminally charged. Now, I think there's a distinction there. If an officer's not criminally charged and it's an administrative issue, I think just like any employer, we are bound to keep that confidential.
Can you speak to the importance of confidential conversations, confidential information that maybe the chief would receive that wouldn't be shared with the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's critical. I mean, if we're going to move the agency or mitigate crime, I mean, there have to be confidential conversations that the chief has with his staff, with professional services, or a community member. If he were to tell the community every time someone told him where a dope house is, then people wouldn't feel comfortable coming forward. Or vice versa, if the chief were to say, hey, Kendale Adams has come forward and said that another officer is corrupt, then Kendale Adams wouldn't feel comfortable coming forward with any new information. And that would hold true for the 17 plus officers. Yeah, I'm just using my example. So, yeah, I mean, you have to have, there are certainly private conversations or privileged conversations that the chief has to have to move the agency forward and to instill trust within the agency and the community that the information shared with him is not necessarily going to be made public. But for the most part, I think Chief Taylor and the entire executive staff is committed to being transparent when we can.
One would argue that this conversation alone is a demonstration of transparency. Would you agree with that? Any thoughts on that statement?
Absolutely. I mean, I think having these kind of tough conversations makes us all reflect. Where can we get better? And I'm certainly, through this process, I think we'll probably identify some other areas we can get better. I think we'll also identify some areas that we're doing really well. I think some of those things that I talked about earlier are areas that we're doing well. One of the things I didn't mention is with the body cams, for example. When we started having conversations about the policy, we reached out to community groups. We reached out to officers. We reached out to the American Civil Liberties Union to discuss with them our policy. That was all in an effort to be as transparent and get as much feedback as we could. Same with the Civilian General Orders Board, right? That involves civilians with different perspectives. It also involves police officers. So again, it's all of us, police, community, meeting at the table and discussing having these tough conversations that really gets us to the legitimacy. And ultimately, legitimacy gets us to trust, and trust reduces crime.